Poplio. Today, on the 37th day of my action, I will continue talking about the evolution of the methods used to control population growth by killing people or by forcing them to migrate. 3 days ago, I covered only infanticide, cannibalism, and war. 2 days ago, I talked about human ritual sacrifice, slavery, and genocide. And yesterday, I presented forced migration, social exclusion, and death by overwork. Today, I will cover self-immolation, witch burning, and biological warfare. Let us start with self-immolation. Sati, or sahagama, the Indian words describing acts of self-immolation. While infanticide and castration helped balance the male and female population prior to marriage, the custom of self-immolation, sati or sahagama, imposed on any married woman whose husband died and who had to burn with him on the funeral pyre during the cremation, kept the sex ratio balanced after marriage and spared society of having to care for widows, serving therefore both a demographic and economic purpose. The Muslim Mughals, who were polygamous and therefore did not need to balance the sex ratio, banned the practice, while the Hindu Rajput clans, who were monogamous, continued it. Although criminalized in 1987 by the Sati Prevention Act, it still happens today in rural areas on very rare occasions. The practice goes back to 300 BCE, according to Greek sources, but became regular after 500 CE, and over the centuries ended the lives of millions of women. Since many men died young, in the flower of their reproductive years, and their wives, who were even younger, had to die with them, the practice also had a statistically significant impact on India's birth rate, and not just on its efforts to balance the genders. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, the practice was also prominent among Brahmins because their widows had inheritance rights that would have clashed with the interests of their children or of neighbors who wished to annex their property and who therefore pressured widows to throw themselves into the fire. When women did not voluntarily sacrifice themselves, they were either drugged or tied. In the best case scenario, society punished widows who refused the honor of dying by self-immolation, by shaving their heads and castigating them out of the community, thus condemning them to starvation. To make the practice more attractive and compelling to women, the priests invented the notion that once a dutiful wife, pativrata, decides to burn with her husband, she becomes a woman endowed with supernatural powers. Sativrata, yes. And after enduring cremation, she is transformed into a spiritual embodiment of goodness and the principal protector of her family. Sati Mata is the Indian word for that. While the old Vedic texts make no mention of sati, the Mahabharata from 300 BC to 300 CE and the Vishnu Smriti from 600 to 900 CE, religious texts do. I quote, "When a woman's husband has died, she should either practice ascetic celibacy or ascend the funeral pyre after him." End of quote. This is from the Vishnu Smriti. Once again, the original spiritual teachings and texts were perverted by later Brahmins to provide justification for a practice that was at best suicide and as such clearly condemned by the Vedas, which state, I quote, "One shall not die before the span of one's life is run out." End of quote. The existential pressures of population growth and resource scarcity have again and again corrupted the letter and spirit of the Hindu faith, and indeed of all faiths. Sannyasa, renunciation, is the male equivalent for sati. Whereas widows were encouraged or forced to commit suicide by sati, widowers in particular and old men in general were encouraged to seek a life of renunciation in the fourth and last stage of their lives. the so-called sannyasa stage, to avoid being a burden on their families and the community. By becoming a sannyasi, a male renunciant, or a sannyasini, a female renunciant, since this option was open to women as well, they had to renounce all worldly and materialistic pursuits and dedicate themselves entirely to spiritual pursuits. This facilitated the orderly transition of property from one generation to another prior to death, which took place already during the third stage of life, therefore making inheritance between siblings less prone to conflict. It also lowered the old age burden, since a sannyasi was expected to live an ascetic life in the forest, and he would no longer be a burden on the family or on the community, and a short-lived burden on society at large, since the life of an ascetic was hard and therefore short. The modern version of self-immolation is sex-selective abortion. Female fetuses that are selectively aborted in most cases, which is why China and India have more men than women. Due to sex-selective abortion, 8% fewer females are born than males in India and 14% fewer females than males in China. It is much easier to commit the latest version of infanticide, namely abortion, than it is to commit matricide and patricide, which is why now, unlike in the past, females are killed preemptively. On to the second method of killing people, the Inquisition and witch burning. The European version of the Indian practice of sati, or self-immolation, is the witch burning practiced by the Inquisition. It also targeted mostly women, and it also forced them into the fire to die in agony. What differed is the justification used by the European elite to kill women in such a gruesome manner. As a result of monogamy, legal and labor inequality, women who found themselves without a male guardian and became destitute had to resort to creative ways of eking out a living, if unwilling to sell their bodies, unable to find a position as servants in wealthy households, reluctant to become nuns, or unskilled in a craft. Many did so by making and selling potions and ointments for various ailments and superstitions, and found themselves accused of heresy or witchcraft by the Inquisition, an institution that had its start in the 12th century France, of course in France. I say of course because nearly all European methods of depopulation originated in France, and was created under the pretext of combating apostasy and heresy by conducting inquests of people suspected of either offense. It is no coincidence that the First Inquisition began at the end of the 12th century, as this is the time when famine caused by overpopulation began rearing its ugly head with increasing frequency. It is also the time when the Crusades took the lives of an increasingly high number of men, leaving a growing proportion of women without the prospect of finding a husband, and widowing women already married. As this imbalance of women could no longer be absorbed by prostitution, servitude, guilds, and monasticism, the Church had to act, and did so by giving the Inquisition free rein to torture witchcraft confessions out of as many women as necessary, to kill in order to restore the semblance of numerical balance between the genders. An excess of women also posed a threat to the institution of marriage and to monogamy, causing a series of marital and consequently social problems, not least of all that of children born out of wedlock. The Hindus, as we have seen, used sati, self-immolation, to keep the genders in balance, while the Jews and Muslims used polygamy. The Christian solution was the Inquisition, and the pretext for burning women at the stake was witchcraft. The ritual of public penance through death by burning was deemed an act of faith, auto da fe. Historians are still debating how many women were killed as witches by the Inquisition during the 6 centuries of its activity, from 1184, when the first Inquisition was established in Languedoc to rout the heretic Cathars or Albigensians, until the Spanish Inquisition was outlawed in 1834, and their estimates run from tens of thousands to several million. The correct answer, however, is that the number of women killed was no more and no less than necessary to re-establish gender balance region by region, to the point where the accusations of witchcraft would stop, because the social and economic pressure of too many excess women would be alleviated. It is equally correct to point out that the first Inquisitions waged war on heterodoxy, hounding mostly heretical men, conversos, which is the name used in Spain for Jews or Muslims who converted to Christianity, and moriscos, the name used for the descendants of Muslim inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula who were forcibly converted to Christianity but who often practiced Islam secretly. While the latter inquisitions targeted mostly women conveniently accused of witchcraft. Certain is that the Inquisition killed far more women than men, since 80% of those charged with witchcraft were women, and they were 4 times more likely than men to be executed. For every man burned at the stake, as many as 20 women met the same fate, because the purpose of the witch hunts was to address the problem of gender imbalance. The true purpose of the Inquisition is also reflected in the misogynistic nature of Maleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, the manual published in 1487 for the prosecution of witchcraft by German Dominican monks Heinrich Kremer and Jakob Sprenger, who intentionally depicted women as inherently evil, sexually licentious, inferior to men, immoderate, deceptive, and superstitious to facilitate their demonization, bestialization, and execution. It is only after the publication of Maleus Maleficarum that the femicide grew violent and fanatical. No such bias was evident in the Directorium Inquisitorum, Manual of Inquisitors, authored by Dominican friar Nicolas Eymerich in 1376 and used by inquisitors throughout Europe as the definitive handbook for the prosecution of heretics who are almost always men. To be able to target such a disproportionate number of women, the Church had to create the social and legal environment for their prosecution, and witchcraft was the only plausible excuse it could find. Herein we have a further perversion of the law, this time ecclesiastical, to serve a role in the population control program. This process started with the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, issued in 1525, which authorized the use of torture by the Inquisition as a tool of interrogation, originally for heretics, but without which no false confessions of witchcraft could have been extracted from women once the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, desiring with supreme ardor, which recognized the existence of witches, was issued in 1484. In England, which was beyond the power of the Catholic Church since the Act of Supremacy of 1534, the legal pursuit of witches was enabled by the Witchcraft Act, passed by Parliament in 1542, repealed a few years later, restored in 1562, and widened in 1604 during the reign of James I, who transferred the trial of witches from the Church to ordinary courts. Secular courts throughout Christendom were even more radical in their pursuit of destitute women, conveniently deemed witches than religious authorities, since they were the first to feel their social and economic impact. According to some historians, the Inquisition was established to stop unjust executions by state courts that deemed heresy a capital offense, according to both the Code of Justinian and Roman law, and viewed witchcraft as a form of heresy but lacked the ecclesiastical training to be good judges. While this may well be the case, or may well have been the case, the fact remains that the prosecution of women as witches was legitimized by papal bulls and instrumentalized by the Dominicans, who were assigned the task of acting as inquisitors in 1231 by Pope Gregory IX, and in so doing deviated greatly from their original purpose to preach the gospel and combat heresy by saving souls. The Dominicans did not come to be called Dominicanes, hounds of the Lord, for their compassion, but for their brutality. The role of the Dominicans as executioners of destitute women marks a watershed moment in the Church's evolution as Christendom's population control hydra, a monster with multiple heads, each specialized in a specific aspect of population control. The Hospitallers used biological warfare to cull the population and re-establish balance between people and resources, as we will see, thus safeguarding Christians from famine and ensuring their prosperity. The Dominicans used the selective murder of women to re-establish gender balance, thus safeguarding Christian monogamy and ensuring social equilibrium. The Jesuits used spiritual indoctrination to convert the indigenous populations of conquered lands, thus extending the supremacy of the Christian faith by annihilating other belief systems in order to appropriate their lands and subject them to Christian control. The modern version of the Inquisition and witch burnings is death by polypharmacy. Drug abuse, smoking, and alcoholism, methods that burn human health from within and leave behind only corpses. Drug abuse, smoking, and alcoholism affect mostly men, while polypharmacy affects mostly women. Polypharmacy, defined as the concurrent use of multiple medications by a single individual, is a method of shortening life devised to address the problem of women living longer than men and being therefore a burden on society for much longer than men. To affect as many women as possible, doctors are taught to prescribe drugs for invented medical problems such as high cholesterol and high blood pressure, or problems that can be fixed by changes in diet and physical activity. Women, therefore, are prescribed drugs for multiple morbidities. They receive far more antidepressants and sedatives than men, as well as more cardiovascular and gastrointestinal drugs, and hormones and analgesics, and as a result are at greater risk of prescription drug abuse. Women also metabolize drugs differently than men, which leads to higher rates of adverse drug events. The deaths caused by polypharmacy, adverse drug events, incorrect, delayed, or missed diagnoses are termed medical errors. In the US alone, 250,000 to 400,000 deaths annually are the result of medical errors, making this the third leading cause of death, and as many as 800,000 suffer preventable harm. In Europe, 150,000 to 400,000 people die annually due to medical errors. The WHO estimates that globally there is one death per million people caused by medical errors. The third subject today is biological warfare and plagues. And hang on for this one because it is brutal. The highest expression of civilization is the city. Cities rose and bloomed during the formative years of human civilization, and along with them the problems posed by dense urban living, how to bring enough food and water into the cities, how to keep the water clean, where to put the trash, and what to do with urine and excrement. City folks and animals live together and in each other's filth, but unlike country folks who use the dunghill as fertilizer and fuel, city dwellers had no use for the domestic waste that in the best case ended up in the mines beyond the city walls. Trash was piled up everywhere in the streets, houses, and courtyards, and now forms the strata archaeologists comb through for artifacts. Life in the city was a life in filth, and filth attracted vermin and scavengers and begot death and disease. Even when the latrine was invented sometimes in the 3rd millennium BCE, it was used only by the wealthy in cities like Ur, Abu Salabik, Nippur, and Diyala, and did little to spare the inhabitants from urine and excrement as they drained onto the streets or just a few feet underground. Standing wastewater and its stench were constant sources of transmission of fecal-oral diseases, typhoid, cholera, hepatitis, polio, and so on, that killed infants in particular. Never before had human beings interacted with one another physically and socially in such close quarters. High numbers and suboptimal living conditions. The cost of this new experiment in living was a constant ebb and flow of contagious disease epidemics. Fumigation, isolation, herbs, incantations, and rituals, the medical remedies of the day were no match for the destructive powers of plagues, which were blamed on the anger of deities. The healers of the day could do no more than isolate the sick, burn their belongings, and fumigate their dwellings. Other than that, they prayed and interpreted omens, since magic and medicine knew no distinction. Prevention consisted of burying figures of divine beings under the threshold amid elaborate rituals and loud incantations to ward off evil, just flaccid superstitions. Not surprisingly, pestilence was the primary cause of death throughout the formative years of cities, but still the overall population increased primarily due to growth in the countryside. The various epidemics of typhus, influenza, smallpox, and bubonic plague have washed across the world in antiquity, causing suffering and death, but no sooner was Europe firmly in the grip of the Church, the bubonic plague began visiting the continent with conspicuous regularity and leaving behind destruction of human life at a scale never before seen anywhere else on earth. This is no coincidence, but the hand of the Church, for it used disease as opportunistically as schisms to trim back the population. The first major epidemic of the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, in Christendom occurred in 542 in Constantinople, marking the beginning of what history has come to know as the Plague of Justinian. From 541 to 571, it spread across West Asia and the Mediterranean. It was commonly thought that it came from Egypt along with grain imports to Byzantium, though recent genetic evidence has shown that ancestral Yersinia pestis strains were common in Europe and Asia for more than 3,000 years prior to the Plague of Justinian. According to Bishop Gregory of Tours, who lived from 538 to 594 CE, who chronicled two outbreaks of plague in 543 and 571 in the Vienne and Clermont area in south-central France, and several recurring outbreaks in Marseille and its surroundings, the disease appears to have become endemic in southern Europe by the end of the 6th century. It continued to cause outbreaks throughout Europe for the next 200 years, but with limited casualties and without causing a demographic disaster. Unlike the late antique plague of Justinian, the medieval plague, known as the Second Plague Pandemic or the Black Death, that swept across Europe from 1346 to 1353 CE, wiped out 30 to 60% of Europe's population, despite the fact that the Yersinia pestis bacterium that caused the Black Death was no more virulent than the Yersinia pestis that caused the plague of Justinian, according to current DNA studies. This second plague pandemic was blamed on the Mongols, who during the siege of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula in 1348 threw diseased corpses over the city walls to infect the trapped population. From its onset, therefore, it is human intervention that made the second plague pandemic so much more virulent and deadly than the first. The Mongols, however, did not start the pandemic, but three Christian entities who, as we will see, deliberately spread it throughout the continent. The Church recognized the evangelizing, economic, and ultimately demographic potential of the disease in the aftermath of the plague of Justinian and decided to use it as a population control instrument or a substitute to war under duress from the French monarchy. This methodology of war, biological warfare, was imposed on the papacy by the Capetian dynasty during the time it held a series of popes captive in Avignon from 1309 to 1376. The history of the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, also called the Knights Hospitaller, made them the best candidate for carrying out biological warfare on behalf of the papacy and the French monarchy. By the beginning of the 14th century, the Knights Hospitallers held property across Europe and ships throughout the Mediterranean and were ideally positioned to spread the plague in almost every corner of the continent, from their home base on the island of Rhodes from 1309 to 1522, and later from Malta from 1530 to 1798. The Knights Hospitaller, therefore, had the medical knowledge, the military training, the Europe-wide presence, the fleet, and the political and spiritual support necessary to wage biological war. More than this, they were soldiers, whose business was death, and their original mission to succor the poor and the sick, to contain militant Islam, and to prevent the spread of disease, which gave them the perfect cover to commit any and all atrocities. They were hardened by the triple vow common to all religious orders, the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and had neither wives nor children, and therefore no emotional ties to the world, which they had renounced upon becoming members of the order to live communally and separate from the population at large. By spreading the plague, they did not risk killing their own wives and children, since they had none. They were exempt from civil laws, the jurisdiction of bishops, and the payment of tithes. They enjoyed free passage across Christendom, were answerable only to the Pope, were authorized to collect alms, to build their own churches and cemeteries, and to bury the dead. They were, in other words, endowed with all privileges necessary to kill at will and suffered no consequences. And since the poor could not be helped so long as the population doubled every 20 years, the only way to break the cycle of poverty and help society climb out of the poverty trap was to periodically cull the population. The three people personally responsible for killing an estimated 100 million people, most of them Europeans, are King Philip VI of France, who ruled from 1328 to 1350 of the Capetian dynasty, the House of Valois; Pope Clement VI, who was Pope from 1342 to 1352, born Pierre Roger from a noble French family; and Dieudonné de Gauzon, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, who was in charge from 1346 to 1353 for the entire duration of the plague, and also of French noble descent. Three individuals, all French, are responsible for the biggest crime in history, which reduced the world population from 450 to 350 million people in just 8 years. It should be mentioned that most of the cardinals at the time were French too, and that similarly most of the Knights Hospitaller at the time were French. All three institutions, therefore, were fully controlled by French individuals of noble descent. The biggest crime in history has an entirely French fingerprint, and biological warfare as a method of depopulation came about fully as a result of a French conspiracy between the secular, spiritual, and military leaders of the time, all members of the French nobility. But why? A confluence of factors brought about this outcome. First, a rapid and unsustainable population growth between 1000 and 1340 CE, time during which the population of Europe swelled from circa 38 million to about 74 million people. Second, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed 10% of Europe's population, causing crime and social unrest, as well as recurring famines in the Kingdom of France throughout the first half of the 14th century. And third, the loss of the Holy Land and the Levant to the Saracens at the end of the 12th century, and the ensuing need to repurpose the military orders. Conventional war was too expensive, whereas biological war was cheap by comparison and killed men, women, and children alike, and did not leave behind a lopsided population structure with too many females and orphans that society would have to somehow care for. The order used its extensive estates to discreetly infect the European population with the plague, starting with the Mediterranean seaports, all of which it could reach with its own galleys. And the only parts of the continent that were spared were those where the Knights Hospitaller had no priories and commanderies, and therefore no physical presence, namely Poland, and to a lesser extent Eastern Europe, where they had a stronghold only in what is now southern Romania. Having established themselves as the most effective population control instrument on the continent, the Hospitallers continued to use the plague not only in service to the papacy and the French monarchy, but also for their own ends to terrorize and punish their enemies. As expected, Christendom's, and by extension the Knights' enemies, the Saracens, the Persians, and the Ottomans, were hit first and most relentlessly. The Knights' own businesses, competitors, the Venetian Republic and the Kingdom of Naples, were second only to the Muslims at the receiving end of the Hospitaller plague. And closing the circle were the English for declaring their independence of the papacy and for chasing away the Hospitallers from the British Isles. The plague, as a method of depopulation, remained part of the papacy's and Hospitallers' arsenal of population control methods until the beginning of the 19th century. And due to their geographic proximity to the Hospitaller stronghold on Malta, the Venetians, their foremost maritime competitors, suffered even more than the British at the hands of the Hospitaller plagues. Venice experienced 14 plague visitations between 1456 and 1528 alone, despite being the first to build a hospital dedicated to plague victims in 1423 on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth, instituting the first quarantine for ships in 1448. Incidentally, the word quarantine comes from the Italian word quarantena, which means 40 days, setting up a health office in 1490, and even fumigating mail to ensure no plague was sneaked into the Serenissima by envelope. The Serenissima means the most serene and was Venice's formal name at the time, the most serene republic. Nevertheless, the outbreaks of 1575 to 76 and 1630 to 31 claimed 25% to 30% of Venice's population, respectively. The Mediterranean islands owned by the Venetians suffered the same fate as Venice. Crete, for instance, was struck by the disease 13 times from 1362 to 1489. Ever since their creation in the 11th century, the Hospitallers fought Islam, first from Jerusalem until its fall in 1291, then from Rhodes until 1522, and last from Malta until 1798, when they lost the island to Napoleon. From 1799 until 1801, their headquarters moved to St. Petersburg in Russia, and their attention became focused on the Ottoman Empire. The Saracens had served not only as a testing ground for the Hospitaller plague before the Black Death, but also as a constant target thereafter, although with limited success, since they lacked the network of people and properties from where to spread the plague, and also because Muslims had better sanitary habits than Christians at that time and were not as flea infested. Furthermore, the Muslims were protected by the climate, since plague thrives only in warm, moist weather between 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 15 to 27 degrees Celsius. The Hospitallers had the most success waging biological warfare on the Ottoman Empire once they made Russia their headquarters in 1799, instituted the Russian Grand Priory, and received the assistance of the Russian Tsar Paul I, who became the Order's Grand Master in 1798, and was followed by another Russian, Nikolai Saltykov, in 1801. The Russians harbored the Hospitallers out of gratitude for the help they received from the Order to control their own population growth in 1770 to 1772, when a Hospitaller plague claimed the lives of 100,000 people in Moscow alone and alleviated the Russian Empire's dire famine problems. The wet, cold climate of Russia made the Hospitallers' work easy, as they enabled the development of the pneumonic plague, which is transmissible from person to person and is more deadly than septicemic and bubonic plague. The Russians and the Hospitallers brought the plague upon the Ottomans in 1801, 1812 to 1814, 1829 to 1832, 1834 to 1836, 1853, and in 1876. The 1812 epidemic assault caused the most deaths at around 300,000. Hard as they tried, the Russian Hospitaller coalition did not succeed in striking the Muslims at the heart of their empire in Mecca and Medina, which remained untouched because neither the Russians nor the Hospitallers could get in unnoticed, and of course because the searing heat and arid air of the Arabian Peninsula was no environment where the Yersinia pestis bacterium could survive, let alone thrive. By the 19th century, the plague had become part of the colonial military arsenal of both France and England, who put it to good use in India and China soon after establishing a foothold on their territories. The so-called Third Plague pandemic, which barely touched the rest of the world, caused 12 to 15 million casualties in India and China between 1855 and 1857, both of them firmly under British control by then. The British continued to wage biological warfare on the Indian population throughout the 19th and 20th centuries with increasing success. To draw greater profits from China, the British who did not have enough silver to purchase Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, used Indian opium to bridge the problem of payment, causing a generation of opium addicts between 1790 and 1832 and great social instability. This led to the First Opium War, fought between Qing China and the United Kingdom from 1839 to 1842, and the Second Opium War, fought between Qing China and the United Kingdom and France between 1856 and 1860. The bubonic plague, unleashed on China by the British and the French, was a strategic attack to weaken the Qing dynasty politically, economically, and militarily between the two opium wars. The Grand British strategy in its Asian colonies was to wage biological war on the Indians with the bubonic plague and chemical war on the Chinese with opium. In so doing, it used Indian opium obtained free of cost for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. Through the Black Death pandemic, the triad reduced the population of Europe by at least a third in less than a decade, affording the continent a break from population pressures, attenuating the subsistence crisis, and solving its resource scarcity problems for at least 3 generations, lifting the people out of poverty by increasing wages and the size of landholdings in one swoop, improving the nutrition and health of the general population, and allowing its civilization to flourish and reach the height of the Renaissance. None of this happened smoothly or without a difficult period of readjustment that was disruptive and painful, to say the least. Modern research shows that the people who survived the Black Death lived significantly longer and were healthier than people who lived before the epidemic struck in 1347. Even the landowner, priest, peasant, medieval social order became practically defunct in the aftermath of the Black Death. All subsequent plague epidemics targeted smaller geographic areas when and if a population correction was needed. The more the plague was used as a means of population control, the less effective it became, since more people acquired immunity to it. Modern research attests to the fact that evolutionary adaptive processes driven by the disease may have conferred immunity on later generations. Although the Yersinia pestis bacterium has been sequenced in 2001, very little information about the plague's transmission, virulence, and herd immunity rate is available in the public domain to this day, as there are still attempts to use its lethal powers in countries where population growth destabilizes key environmental areas, countries such as Madagascar, where plague outbreaks have been engineered in 2008, 2014, and 2017, but failed to reach the desired effect because people are generally free of ectoparasites in our time. Biological warfare started as a desperate act to escape chronic famine and prevent social dissolution. It soon became an act of retribution against real and perceived enemies, and in time evolved into a fine-tuned method of population control employed to preserve and increase prosperity. Just as the Roman Catholic Church, the European monarchies, and the military orders had protected Europe from militant Islam with arms and chivalry, so too it protected Europe from poverty and famine, an enemy far more lethal and unforgiving than militant Islam. They did it with the bubonic plague and the willingness to lose their own lives in the process of disseminating it. The principle at work is that of combating fire with fire, of preventing uncontrolled death with preemptively controlled death. The use of the bubonic plague as a way to reduce the population consciously and deliberately is the first paradigm change in the history of population control since the days of the Egyptians, and it happened as much by accident as by design. It marks the marriage of war and medicine in the service of population control, the integration of medicine into the arsenal of population control methods, and the transformation of medicine into a handmaiden of genocide. In the final analysis, a quick death by plague followed by half a century of prosperity was preferable to a slow death by hunger and inescapable misery. A quick death in the face of such horrible odds and hopeless future was and remains an act of mercy. The modern version of biological warfare is the entire medical cartel and big pharma industry which set fire to human health in order to reduce the population. Their latest handiwork is the COVID pandemic, whose role has been to kill as many old people as possible in the developed world and to sterilize as many young people as possible in the developing world. So far, nearly 30 million people have been killed with mRNA vaccines under the pretext of combating COVID, and about 32 million births were prevented. These numbers apply only to the G20 nations. I have yet to tally the global number of victims. Biological warfare is also being used to reduce the number of domestic animals in order to cause famine and kill millions by starvation. To this end, the avian flu, the swine flu, and the H5N1 influenza have been invented to kill millions of chickens, pigs, and cows. The horrors of population control by covert methods continue because the criminals, cretins, and cowards who govern us spiritually and politically refuse to empower mankind to assume command and control over the sacred task of limiting human life on the planet. The time has come to put an end to this. Otherwise, these idiots will kill all life on Earth, human and non-human. Thank you for your attention.